Hello, and thank you for joining today's webinar at the New York Botanical Garden. I'm Lawrence Kelly, Vice President for Science Administration at the Garden. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's presentation, Traditional Farming and Crop Diversity for a More Resilient Future. At any time during today's event, you're welcome to submit questions by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your window, and we'll gather these for our speaker to answer at the end of the presentation. Live captions can be enabled by clicking the CC button, then show subtitles or view full transcript. Today's presentation is being recorded and will be available in the NYBG Lecture Library. In conjunction with Climate Week NYC, the New York Botanical Garden joins organizations across the city to showcase and accelerate global climate action. Our role in this conversation is to highlight the inextricable connection between plant diversity, climate, and human health and survival. In today's lecture, NYBG ethnobotanist Alex McAlvay will examine agriculture and farming on the front lines of climate change. To introduce today's speaker, I'm happy to turn it over to Dr. Chris Peers, Dean of Science at the New York Botanical Garden. Over to you, Chris.
Hello, welcome everybody. Good morning. I'm Chris Peers, the new Dean of Science and the Chief Science Officer of the New York Botanic Garden. And I'm happy to introduce Alex McAlvay today. Alex got his PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. His dissertation, which he'll talk about today, was on the domestication, escape, and re-domestication of the crop species Brassica rapa. Alex started his work at New York Botanic Garden last year in the midst of the pandemic. And he is now an assistant curator in the Institute of Economic Botany, or ethnobotany. His research focuses on plants and cultures, so biocultural evolution as well, and specifically how indigenous communities steward plant diversity in their environments. His research takes place in Canada, the US, Mexico, Ethiopia, and elsewhere. And I'm happy to introduce Alex's talk today on traditional farming and crop diversity for a more resilient future. Take it away, Alex.
All right. Thank you, Larry, and thank you, Chris. It's a pleasure to be here this morning, and thank you all for attending and listening. Today, I'll be talking about the impacts of climate change on agriculture and the importance of biodiversity as a tool for us all to adapt. Before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to recognize that the New York Botanical Garden is located on the ancestral homeland of the Lenape people. We honor them and acknowledge their displacement and dispossession and their continued presence on the land. Agriculture is expected to be one of the hardest hit spheres of our society from climate change. Climate change impacts nearly every parameter that crops need to grow, including temperature and precipitation. And crops will be heavily impacted by the extreme weather events, as well as the shifts in the ranges of pests and pathogens with climate change. Estimates show that by 2050, we anticipate up to a 17% reduction in agricultural productivity due to climate change. This comes at a time where we're already facing issues around food security. Additionally, by 2050, it's expected that we'll need to produce 50% more food to feed the world. These impacts are not expected to affect everyone equally, causing equity issues along gender, race, and socioeconomic lines. While small-scale farmers are expected to be heavily impacted by climate change, large-scale industrial farming also presents unique vulnerabilities. This includes homogeneous crops, with many farmers only growing a single variety of a single crop species, a practice that makes their crops more vulnerable to new stresses. Another challenge is that many of our crops are bred to rely on large amounts of water, a resource that is already facing scarcity in some agricultural areas like parts of California. Additionally, many of our crop landscapes themselves are homogeneous, without much diversity of ecosystem types, including forests, marshes, prairies, or other types of ecosystems. These simple landscapes lack the ecosystem services of more heterogeneous landscapes. Many adaptation strategies are being explored to address these challenges. We will likely have to grow crops in different areas to follow their suitable ranges. For example, 90% of Nicaragua's coffee growing areas are expected to not support coffee by 2050. But in some areas of the world, farmers will be able to move their coffee to higher altitudes or different latitudes to escape the heat. Another strategy is breeding more resilient varieties. For example, breeding a more heat-tolerant coffee. Other innovations include new tools for farmers that keep track of micro-variation on their farms to optimize yield, as well as moving agriculture indoors into climate-controlled areas. All of these approaches will likely be helpful in adapting our agricultural systems in the face of climate change. But many scientists agree that one other approach will be essential moving forward: diversifying our food system. This can take many forms, but a key resource is agricultural biodiversity, also known as agrobiodiversity. This is not a new resource, and farmers have leveraged it for thousands of years to endure gradual changes in climate as well as extreme weather events. Agrobiodiversity is diversity in the crop varieties that farmers grow, their genetic diversity, in the diversity of different crop species that farmers grow, and in the larger agricultural landscapes. In some cases, this agrobiodiversity provides stability and adaptability to farming systems. One scale of agrobiodiversity is the level of genetic diversity in crop varieties. This includes the different corn varieties grown by a single farmer in Guatemala, as well as all of the varieties of corn held in seed banks and grown by farmers worldwide. But first, we should explain a little bit about how we got all of this diversity of crop varieties. How did we get from this wild pepper plant to so many different types of heirloom varieties of pepper in the same species? The process is similar to what happened to wolves after thousands of years of humans selecting for different breeds of dogs. Similarly, our crops like corn started out as wild plants, like teosinte, seen at left. Humans domesticated them and bred them for desirable characteristics, like taste, color, texture, and hardiness to local environments. This happened in many parts of the world, largely over the last 10,000 years. So why should we preserve all of these heirloom varieties? While we all enjoy the flavors and colors of heirloom tomatoes at the farmer's market, there's another reason. Different varieties harbor different resistances to environmental stresses. For example, this green variety might be resistant to powdery mildew, and this red striped one might be more tolerant to drought. One important example of this is the Irish potato famine. In Peru, there are over 4,000 varieties of potato. Some of them you may have seen recently in your grocery store, like the purple potatoes and fingerlings, and some of them are not well known outside of the Andes, like the knobby ones you see and the multicolored ones in this picture. But only a few varieties were brought to Ireland, and a single variety, the Irish lumper, became widespread because it tolerated the damp climate well. But unfortunately, it was also highly susceptible to a particular disease, a water mold, which swept through the country and led to the starvation of more than 1 million people and the migration of 1 million more. Meanwhile, in Peru, where farmers regularly grow a dozen varieties of potato in their fields, it would be likely that at least one of their varieties would have some degree of resistance to a given disease. This diversity is how agrobiodiversity grants resilience at different scales, at the farmer scale, the country scale, and at the global scale. With climate change, this heirloom crop diversity is as important as ever and is being used to breed crops to be resistant to climate change related pressures. For example, scientists were able to breed a flood-resistant rice variety using genetic variants from Indian heirloom rice varieties. In addition to heirlooms, the wild relatives of crops are also a key resource that rice breeders have drawn on. Currently, wild African rice is being used to help global rice crops handle increasing heat. Wild relatives in general play an important role in climate adaptation. As you can see here again, teosinte on the left, which is just a relatively small grass compared to corn and has hard seeds, looks totally different as it's been transformed by domestication into our corn that we see today. Going back to our dog example, wolves are the wild form of dogs, or the wild relative, or the wild progenitor. You might hear all of these words. And while dogs look more diverse than wolves, they actually have much less genetic diversity, since they were domesticated from a very small subset of the global wolf population. You can see that from this example, if we start with these 6 wolves with varied coat colors and breed 2 of them together in an effort to make a red-coated offspring, in the next generation, we continue to breed the red-coated individuals who may be siblings or cousins and end up with greatly reduced genetic variation. This is part of the reason why so many dog breeds have genetic issues with their hips and their hearts. And this same lack of genetic variation makes our crops vulnerable. Because of the enormous genetic variation of wild relatives, they've been widely used for breeding, and sometimes they harbor hidden variation. In one famous example, a wild species of tomato that is green when ripe was crossed with a commercial tomato, resulting in a fruit that was even more red than the commercial fruit. Even the most humble-looking wild relatives can contribute important and sometimes surprising traits. Another famous example of wild relatives protecting our crops is bananas. The main banana clone grown worldwide until the 1950s, the Gros Michel banana, which has a stronger banana-like flavor, and many of our candies actually were created to mimic this flavor, and we no longer have it as dramatically in our bananas. This variety was nearly eliminated from the planet by a fungal disease called Panama disease. Our current variety, Cavendish, is now threatened by a new strain of that same disease, Panama disease TR4, tropical race 4. But researchers have gone back to the wild bananas in Southeast Asia and Oceania and found genes that may be useful to help commercial bananas resist this new strain. Another form of agrobiodiversity is the multiple crops grown on a single farm. Many farmers throughout the years have planted multiple types of crops together. For example, in Mexico, the milpa or coamil system is very common. In these systems, corn, beans, squash, chili peppers, tomatillos, and other crops are grown together in the same plot. These systems also incorporate non-crop plants. Farmers in Mexico tolerate over 200 species of edible weeds in their milpas so they can grow and be eaten. These complex agricultural ecosystems also harness other organisms that would be considered pests in other cultures, like huitlacoche, a fungus that attacks corn but is edible and delicious. A very similar technique to the milpa has been used by Native Americans in parts of the US and Canada and is commonly called the Three Sisters. A Tuscarora agronomist at Cornell named Jane Mount Pleasant documented what farmers have known for millennia, that corn, beans, and squash complement each other, with the corn providing a structure for beans to grow on, beans fixing nitrogen into the soil, and squash shading out weeds and retaining moisture. They are also nutritionally complementary, with a variety of vitamins, minerals, and macronutrients that differ between the different crops. On another scale, agrobiodiversity is also witnessed in larger landscapes. As I mentioned earlier, many of our agricultural landscapes are homogeneous and do not include forests, wetlands, and other ecosystems. This homogeneity can mean a loss of ecosystem services, like less replenishment of groundwater and less habitat for natural enemies of pests, like parasitic wasps, as well as less habitat for pollinators, like the many species of native wild bees. But not all agricultural landscapes are homogeneous. For example, Hungarian farmers and herders traditionally valued heterogeneous landscapes with a nuanced system of names for the different features. Different types of ecosystems provided different resources, like edible mushrooms, lumber, and pasture land, but also provided ecosystem services like those I mentioned previously, including pollinator services and groundwater replenishment. Another dramatic example is the landscapes created by traditional Maya agriculture in Mesoamerica. Farmers traditionally clear small plots of forest to plant their milpas, shifting these sites every few years. This creates a shifting patchwork of different successional or regenerative stages in the forests, each with different ecosystem services and resources in each part, and maximizes the edges between different ecosystems, edges where biodiversity often concentrates. So you can see that at many different scales, Maya farmers and many Mesoamerican farmers in general have maximized agrobiodiversity, growing multiple varieties of corn, growing corn, beans, and squash together, and growing them in these heterogeneous patchworks at a landscape scale. Very different from a monoculture of corn over a whole broad geographic scale. Similar strategies to the Maya forests are used in the Amazon. As the cleared areas regrow, farmers carefully steward the regeneration of the forest to favor particular useful wild species, creating forest gardens. Many traditional agricultural landscapes harness aquatic systems in their diversity. In parts of the Andes, farmers dig canals between rows of crops, which moderate heat, absorbing the sun's heat during the day and radiating it out at night, and also become a source of fertility as fish, algae, and aquatic plants decompose, and the fertile soil is scooped up onto the crops. Similar systems can be found in the Chinampas around Mexico City, which are floating fields separated by canals. Another system in Mexico involves terracing, with perennial plants planted at the bottom of canals to retain moisture in the system. Unfortunately, one of our greatest tools for climate resilience is being lost right when we need it most: agrobiodiversity. In the last century, our heavy dependence on a narrowing number of crops and crop varieties has led to the loss of many less common crops and heirloom varieties. Major land use changes have threatened many of our wild relatives. In addition to the crop diversity being lost is the traditional knowledge from local and indigenous communities of how to use it. Many rural communities face urban migration, acculturation, and pressure to grow cash crops. Despite these pressures, many communities are actively protecting and revitalizing these practices once again. Indigenous and local knowledge plays a growing role in recent reports by the UN on climate change. And just 2 days ago, the US Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland, tweeted that in this time of climate change bearing down upon us, Indigenous knowledge about our natural world will be extremely valuable and important to all of us. While it is key to adapting our agriculture to climate change, it is imperative that this knowledge and these resources are not extracted from communities, as so much else has been, without acknowledgement and compensation, especially given long histories of colonialism and exploitation. I want to share with you some of my research on agrobiodiversity and traditional farming practices. Specifically, I'll talk about examples from Mexico and Ethiopia, focused on the question of how we can understand, preserve, and in some cases, revitalize agrobiodiversity for climate resilience. First, I'll share some work on a global crop, Brassica rapa, which was introduced to Mexico and has been adopted as an edible weed. Then I'll share my work on Ethiopian cereal mixtures that are rapidly disappearing but may hold an important key to climate change resilience for the people who grow them. First, I'll start out with my work on Brassica rapa. Brassica rapa, the Latin name for field mustard, is thought to be native to Eurasia and North Africa, and has been called the dog of the plant world because it has been bred over thousands of years to result in crops as diverse as Chihuahuas and Great Danes. Human selection on wild field mustard plants, reflecting diverse culinary preferences and climatic environments in Eurasia, resulted in turnips, Chinese cabbage and bok choy, bitter greens like broccoli rabe, oil seeds like some types of canola, and dozens of other crops, all from the same species. In addition to being a globally important crop, it's also a globally important weed. At some point, a weedy form was introduced to temperate areas around the world, including parts of Australia, Africa, and the Americas. It's classified as a noxious weed in several Latin American countries and some US states. But in some parts of the Americas, it has been adopted by local farmers as a weedy edible plant, a quelite, that is valued when it emerges in the spring. I was interested in learning more about this global food resource, which provides income for farmers and feeds many people, as well as the implication for local food security in Latin America. This project was undertaken with a large collaborative network of farmers and researchers. Among those involved are the New York Botanical Garden Dean of Science, Chris Piers, who coined the dogs of the plant world analogy, and adjunct New York Botanical Garden scientist, Robert Bai. First, I'll talk about Brassica rapa as a global resource. Understanding where to look for wild and heirloom crop diversity is more important than ever for Brassica rapa in the face of climate change. For example, in South Korea, where Napa cabbage forms a cornerstone of the diet, there's an anticipated 65% reduction in yield over the next 30 years. Unfortunately, it's not clear whether the weedy field mustard around the world is truly wild, a truly wild relative, or an escaped crop. Just like dogs can be found as feral packs in forests and mountains in some parts of the world, domesticated crops can also escape and go feral. For example, weedy carrots and weedy rice are common in many landscapes as invasive plants. It's important to distinguish between the truly wild populations and the escaped populations, since escaped or feral forms tend to have less diversity even than domesticated forms. The second question I was interested in is where this crop was originally domesticated. As we saw with the Peruvian potatoes, the place where a crop is originally domesticated is often also where most heirloom varieties can be found. To answer these two questions, we sequenced DNA from around 600 crop varieties and weeds. For the wild relatives, we found that field mustard growing in the Caucasus Mountains of Central Asia is likely truly wild, while the field mustard in Europe and the Americas is more likely escaped turnips. Up until now, conservation and collection has prioritized Europe, where populations were assumed to be wild. but it's clear we should prioritize these truly wild and highly diverse populations in the Caucasus as well. That said, the broad area that escaped field mustard or escaped turnips inhabit suggests that the local populations in this range may have a wide variety of adaptations to local environments, and may also be an important tool to protect our crops. In regards to the second question of where Brassica rapa was domesticated, we determined that it was likely initially bred from the wild in Central Asia, and the first crop domesticated was likely the turnip, which in turn was selected for leafy types in Europe and Asia, resulting in bok choy, broccoli rabe, and other crops. In summary, the wild relatives and heirloom crops in Central Asia may hold key resources for adapting global brassica crops like turnips, bok choy, and Napa cabbage. Now I want to turn our attention to Brassica rapa as a wild edible plant in Mexico. What we now believe are escaped turnips were introduced as weeds into the Americas over 400 years ago. Since then, over 24 indigenous groups have adopted these weedy plants as food. When they were encountered by farmers, field mustard plants fit nicely into a pre-existing category of weedy edible plants, which I have mentioned before, called quelites in Mexico. They provide important vitamins and minerals to the diet. In order to find out more about the use of field mustard by Mexican farmers, I carried out interviews with farmers from 8 different ethnic groups across Mexico. Many farmers told me that field mustard was a key resource for food security. In late spring and early summer, when the last year's staple crops of maize, beans, and squash are running low, and the next harvest hasn't come in yet, these weeds emerge. These reliable wild vegetables provide an extra nutritional buffer against climate-related stress on staple crops. 5 out of 8 of the groups also sell the plant, especially for birdseed. At big markets in Mexico City, you'll see big mounds of these unripe pods. Multiple vendors told me that it makes the birds sing because it makes them so happy. 2 of the groups also used it as a medicinal plant. And 2 groups recognize it as having a spiritual component, which I found surprising because of its relatively recent introduction only a few centuries ago. But I was most surprised to find that not only do farmers use field mustard for food and medicine, but half of the 8 groups actively encourage it through sowing the seeds or transplanting it. Here's an example from the Northwest where the Raramuri people, in the place where Dr. Robert Bai, our collaborator, works, sow it in dedicated parcels with cow manure. In interviews, Raramuri farmers repeatedly mentioned that they preferred the slower flowering individuals because they preferred to eat the young plants with big, fresh leaves and not the stringy and bitter plants that have already gone to flower. Farmers reported intentionally planting seeds from individuals that took longer to flower. I collected seeds from across the Raramuri territory to see if Raramuri farmers had impacted the evolution of weedy field mustard and had domesticated an heirloom type of Brassica rapa from scratch. I collected seeds from managed populations, tended by farmers, as well as unmanaged populations that were growing on their own beside roads, and grew them together under the same conditions. I found that there was an average of 2.5 more days until flowering from the plants grown out of managed populations, suggesting that Raramuri farmers may have selected for later flowering and made this vegetable truly their own. One issue, however, is that not everyone sees these plants as tasty vegetables. Many industrial farmers and environmental organizations see this as a pest. At a workshop with Robert Bai, we held a session involving Mexican government personnel, traditional and industrialized farmers, and universities to raise awareness of the issue and provide a forum for both sides to share their perspectives. In summary, field mustard is incredibly widely used in Latin America. The implications for food security in Mexico. Garamori people may be domesticating this plant in real time, resulting in novel heirloom varieties. In general, by introducing an so-called invasive weed into their diverse food system, farmers have provided an additional buffer to protect their food security against climate uncertainty. With the Brassica example, we talked about wild relatives and crop diversity at a global scale and the adoption of a weedy edible plant to diversify a local food system. Now we'll be turning our attention to local farming practices in Ethiopia and their potential to contribute climate resilience. Ethiopia is heavily dependent on small-scale farming for food and is already seeing dramatic impacts of climate change, with a devastating drought 5 years ago tied directly to climate change-related alterations in El Nino. We were interested in learning more about how farmers have traditionally managed agrobiodiversity to mitigate risk throughout the country. I'll share with you 2 projects I've been involved in, one on legume crop diversity and another on an indigenous strategy for growing wheat and barley together to deal with uncertain conditions. These projects were undertaken with a large collaborative network of Ethiopian and American researchers and thousands of farmers who generously agreed to share their experience with us. First, I'll talk about the Legume Diversity Project. The Legume Diversity Project trained 24 Ethiopian graduate students who carried out interviews regarding legume diversity throughout the country with over 2,000 farmers. One of our findings was that diversity, instead of being harbored on a single farmer scale with one farmer growing a dozen varieties like Andean potato farmers, crop diversity was instead harbored at a community-wide or regional scale. This figure shows one zone of Ethiopia where there's very high preference for one variety of common bean called chele gobo, and much less for awu gobo, and a quick drop-off in the other varieties. Since most farmers only planted 1 or 2 varieties, this total diversity is mainly held at a very wide geographic scale. This means that crop diversity conservation efforts should also focus at this wider scale, with approaches like community gene banks. Our students also asked farmers about the traits of the varieties they grew. To better understand the full portfolio of traits farmers have at their disposal for adapting to climate change. We documented, for example, high diversity for yield across field pea varieties, but low variation for frost tolerance. So if climate change increases frost in this particular area, it suggests that there may be limited adaptive capacity to deal with this change. Following this research, we're working with the Ethiopian Biodiversity Institute, which manages a national seed bank as well as multiple community seed banks, and deposited examples of seeds from across the country with their national seed bank. The other Ethiopian project is focused on grains, specifically wheat and barley. We've already talked about the advantages of combining multiple crop species and varieties. We talked about the Mexican milpa, that is a combination of dramatically different plants: corn, a grass; beans, a legume; and squash, a cucurbit. We also talked about Peruvian farmers planting multiple varieties of potatoes on their own farm. Much less commonly observed worldwide is a combination of multiple very similar species from the same family. For example, in the top example, we have wheat mixed with barley. In this case, multiple varieties of each. On the bottom, we have fava bean and field pea mixed together in Ethiopia. farmers explained that fava beans provide vertical structure and the peas bind them together, kind of like tomato cages, keeping the whole set of plants from falling over. I'll focus now on our work on cereal mixtures in northern Ethiopia. These mixtures historically were actually very important in a much wider swath, from the United Kingdom to India and down to the Horn of Africa. People would mix cereal crops together, sometimes wheat and barley, sometimes wheat and rye, or barley and oats. But it has died out almost everywhere for human use, except in Eritrea, Ethiopia, some Greek islands, and the Pamir Mountains. Interestingly, the wild relatives of wheat and barley also very frequently grow together in their native range. In the Levant, it's very rare to find wild wheat growing without wild barley nearby. This is interesting because it suggests that these grasses have been co-evolving for maybe millions of years. We were interested in understanding the extent of the practice of mixing wheat and barley in Ethiopia, the benefits for farmers, potential for climate change resilience, and factors threatening the practice's persistence. We carried out farmer interviews and market surveys in 2 regions of northern Ethiopia, Central Tigray and South Wollo. And we documented cases where farmers were planting up to 3 varieties of wheat and 4 varieties of barley together in one field in extremely heterogeneous mixtures. Farmers treated these as a single crop when harvesting, saving, preparing, and sowing. It was interesting to see not only a species mixture, but a variety mixture all in one. Just like the Mesoamerican farmers we saw, this is an example of agrobiodiversity being harnessed by traditional farmers at multiple scales. We also documented a less common mixture of another species of wheat, emmer wheat, mixed with barley, which had not been published about before. And farmers reported almost overwhelmingly better taste and texture as compared with the prevalent breeder's variety of bread wheat. They reported that animals prefer it for fodder, perhaps because of the softer stems of barley. And farmers reported higher drought tolerance and resistance to a fungal disease called rust as well, both of which have implications for climate resilience. Some of these observations are borne out by agronomic trials in Eritrea, just north of Tigray region, where we carried out our interviews. Researchers studying wheat and barley mixtures there found that yield was more stable from year to year in mixtures compared with monocropped wheat varieties. We're curious about how biodiversity on multiple scales might impact climate resilience. For example, these mixtures have diversity at a species level, combining wheat and barley, a variety level, combining red wheat with white wheat and black wheat, and with a genetic level with the immense genetic variation held within each variety. This diversity may provide some buffer in the case of challenges created by climate change. In the case of multi-year trends like drought that we saw 5 years ago, this may provide a unique adaptive capacity, because in the first year when a farmer plants the mixture, it might be 50% wheat and 50% barley. And farmers recognize barley as having more resistance to drought and wheat having more resistance to waterlogging. So if it's a drought year, they might harvest their crop, and the new proportions are 70% barley and 30% wheat, because the wheat didn't do as well in the drought year. The next year, they go to plant the mixture, and they're planting more barley without having to adjust the mixture in any manual way, and potentially buffering the next year of drought. But 76% of farmers interviewed said that the use is decreasing. Many cited the government's promotion of breeders' varieties of wheat. We found farmers that had more access to markets were less likely to plant mixtures than other farmers. This presents a challenge to food security, but also to food sovereignty, since if farmers are growing the monocropped wheat with a relatively narrow tolerance compared to the mixtures, which might do better in marginal conditions, farmers might become more dependent on external aid. This is especially pressing given the recent civil war in Ethiopia, which has cut off supplies and seeds to the Tigray region, making it difficult for farmers growing the improved wheat varieties, which require heavy inputs of water and/or fertilizer. So in summary, we documented the mixtures to be widespread, documenting them in South Wollo Zone, where it had not been previously reported in the literature. And farmers expressed many benefits compared to the sole cropped wheat. And we identified several areas for more investigation in terms of climate resilience, including adaptation to multi-year trends. We also documented several threats that challenge the persistence of this potentially adaptive practice. So the next steps are recruiting 2 Ethiopian master's students to carry out more interviews and get a better sense of the differences in practices across region. We plan to conduct field trials and participatory farmer experiments, and plan to conduct a multi-year study to see how these mixtures compensate for different stresses. At the end of the study, we hope to communicate our findings to the Ethiopian Biodiversity Institute, extension and agronomic branches of the government, and share with them that it's worthwhile to investigate the advantages of these traditional, locally adapted farming practices before they're replaced by improved varieties. In conclusion, agrobiodiversity and traditional knowledge associated with it will be a key resource moving forward in adapting agriculture to climate change. Agriculture not only is impacted by climate change, but also is one of the key drivers of climate change that humans are responsible for. Complex agricultural landscapes like agroforests are thought to sequester carbon effectively and provide other benefits. It's our responsibility to steward this diversity and to support the sovereignty of indigenous and local communities over their traditional food systems in the future. Thank you for your time, and I'm happy to field any questions you might have. Thank you again to all of my the communities that I've worked with, the collaborators I've worked with, and the funders.
Thank you, Alex. That was a wonderful presentation that really, I think, makes a really clear connection between plant diversity, plant science, crop diversity, the health of our planet, and food security. I mean, I think you've really raised a lot of really important topics here and made really clear connections between them. We have some questions in the from the Q&A. Like we've encouraged viewers, if you have questions, please drop them in the Q&A and we'll move down the list. One of the first questions, which I think we'll see a few along these lines, this one is somewhat specific. It's from somebody in the Bronx who asked about urban gardeners. And I think generally I would just phrase the question in terms of how much can urban gardeners do to address this topic of agrobiodiversity that you discussed? And then even more specifically, if you have specific recommendations for what an urban gardener in the Bronx would grow, or where to get information about urban gardening in the Bronx and agrobiodiversity. So could you just speak to that, at least in the general sense of urban gardening as a piece in the puzzle of agrobiodiversity?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Thank you. So there's been a ton of work on home gardens around the world, showing that home gardens are actually some of the biggest hotspots for agrobiodiversity. And they're even hypotheses about home gardens being the origins for domestications in several crops. But if you go to any community garden, you're likely to see more diversity than you are compared to an Iowa cornfield rotated with soybeans. So I think that they're already winning on the agrobiodiversity front. And there are really great resources out there. There's Native Seed Search, which is an organization in Arizona started by Gary Nabhan, which sends indigenous varieties of seeds all around the world and sends them for free to indigenous communities. There's Seed Saver Exchange, which in addition to having the more commercial catalog, also has an exchange program with thousands and thousands of heirloom varieties. People are increasingly experimenting with and growing plants from their homelands, and getting curious about their own ancestral crops and growing those, which I think is exciting. And I didn't mean to paint any gloom and doom picture, because there's so many great examples of revitalization, cultural revival, and hope with all of this. So lots of great examples going on with the Bronx, and we have at New York Botanical Garden the Bronx Green Up program, which works directly with farmers and agrobiodiversity. So
that's great to hear, and I really appreciate the places where you can interject the optimism into the topics you discuss. And I think it's great to know that home gardening and urban gardening can play an important part in maintaining and sustaining agrobiodiversity. So that's really good information. A similar question on this topic of what the average person can do. This is often something that comes up in our webinars. The question is, well, what can I do as a consumer, as a voter, as a proactive person who wants to make a positive impact? And I think we all have a general idea of what the answers to these questions are, but somebody like yourself with so much insight on crop diversity and agrobiodiversity, any suggestions or input you can offer on this question of what the average consumer or average voter does to make a difference?
Yeah, I mean, there are lots of ways to get involved, but actually kind of dovetailing with the last response, plugging into a seed exchange network where you are growing crops and growing them as part of this larger living seed bank that's global. And so when our crops are frozen in time and stored in seed banks like Svalbard in Norway or other, the USDA seed bank, they're not actively adapting. And that's very important for climate change, because they are not tracking the changes as well as they would if they were grown by farmers in the field year after year. So if you can grow your great grandma's, bean variety in your backyard and offer it in a seed exchange network like Seed Savers Exchange. Many countries have them. Many countries have multiple ones. You can be a piece in that global conservation of crop diversity. But otherwise, voting for the agrobiodiversity candidate, whoever that may be.
Sounds good. Thanks. Very specific question. Why does the Ethiopian government have a wheat incentive program?
Right. So there are lots of complex factors there. There's promotion of wheat as an export crop. Ethiopia is looking to balance its trade and looking to up its export of crops, and the global market is more interested in homogeneous products, typically. So the mixture, it's favored by farmers who like its taste and texture for their injeras, their breads, their highly nutritious, low alcohol beers, many uses, but it doesn't make good Wonder Bread. So there's pressure there. There's pressure from NGOs and kind of green revolution ideology of needing high input crops that are bred in kind of a central agricultural research setting. So there's still globally a perception of kind of the backwards farmer who's growing traditional crops. And agrobiodiversity has often been associated with this kind of this bias. For example, colonists coming to Mesoamerica, seeing these forest gardens, did not appreciate or recognize them as forest gardens, and saw them as this kind of hodgepodge of plants growing in an unkempt manner, when actually they were heavily managed and heavily stewarded. So there's a lot of history, some of it tied to colonialism, that's associated with our attitudes towards diversity in our crops.
Sounds good. Here's another question. This would be just sort of more a general pitch for and some discussion of ethnobotany, and specifically biocultural conservation. How do native languages and plant naming practices play a part in your work and in the field generally? Separately, how do you ensure that the people sharing their knowledge benefit from the sharing of their knowledge, rather than all the benefit going to the large agro company?
Right, great. So the first part with language, language is very often encoded with knowledge about biodiversity. So it's not only encoded with characteristics. So for example, with oca, a crop in Andes, it looks like a potato, but it's sour in a different botanical family. Farmers have different names for their different varieties. And some of the differences are unclear to the untrained eye. So an agronomist coming in looking to conserve oca biodiversity might collect, one of each, and they think, oh, I've collected the yellow one, I'm all set with yellow ones. But there's yellow ones that have different names in Quechua and Aymara languages, the indigenous languages there, which encodes something about the taste and the sourness, and even the underlying genetics of it, because some of them have extra copies of their genome, which make them more sour. So they can point global conservation efforts towards agrobiodiversity. They also encode species interactions. So names can translate to things like weevil's favorite food, or resists flea beetles. And so there's knowledge encoded there. In terms of the second question about non-exploitative relationships with indigenous communities and agrobiodiversity and knowledge, I think that's a question that's at the forefront of everyone's mind, especially as it's becoming more and more urgent. And there have been enough examples in the past of this being done the wrong way, and so people are scrambling to figure it out. And I think that that letting these communities speak for themselves, have a place at the table, and represent themselves is really a big step, and not having it be a one-sided top-down relationship. Projects that are actually genuinely planned with local communities, rather than thought up somewhere and imported and executed. So I think that's a growing edge in the field.
And throughout science, I would say, decolonization of science in general.
Absolutely.
We have a question here about on a landscape level. Could you comment on the site diversity used for cultivation? Such like you talked a little about terracing and microsites in the highlands. I'm interested in how these diverse, smaller scale agrobiodiverse systems contribute to livelihood and resilience during environmental stress, such as climate change.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there are examples from traditional agriculture where you have Northern European hedgerows, for example, or in many countries, a tradition of leaving a tree or two. You can find that in Ireland, where people will spare the hawthorn trees from the axe when they're clearing their fields. You can find it in Mexico when people, spare a tree for shade in the field. And that's going to be, moderating the microclimate next to it. It might be harboring natural enemies. In some cases, it's unclear what's intentional and what's not intentional. And in some cases, I don't know if it's important. If, someone is thinking, I'm going to leave this tree so it can house the wasps that predate this caterpillar. And so I think sometimes it's just an outcome of wanting to have multi-use spaces, multi-ecosystem services kind of emerge from that sometimes. But a lot of it is very intentional and based in thousands of years and even thousands of generations of local observation and empirical study. Just, it's the same process as other forms of science that are based on observation and experimentation.
Alex, can I ask you a quick question?
Yeah.
I know within the field that you study, there have been various periods of how the field's evolved. So can you say something about these discussions, like, from economic botany to whatever we are now, ethnobotany 2.0 or 6.0? I think you've talked about these different phases. Can you just comment generally about, what's the difference between economic botany and ethnobotany? Just some general sense of what you and people who do your kind of work have thought about that.
Sure. Yeah. So I guess in general, ethnobotany is the study of plants and cultures, plants and people, which is really quite a large field, as that intersection is pretty big. So it kind of started with understanding usage of plants for medicines and food and clothing and shelter. Then the second phase moved in towards more looking at linguistics and its role and cognitive and psychological aspects of how people conceive of and conceptualize their plants and their environment and categorize them. And then it moved into a phase of ethnoecology, or understanding the plants and the environment, the kind of interactions of plants and humans and ecosystems. And then it moved into conversations about intellectual property rights and who gets to own the knowledge and who gets to share the knowledge. The fifth phase is ethnobotany, really for climate change and facing all of our global problems. And then the most recent phase that's been proposed is kind of a decolonizing lens, asking how we can move away from the roots of exploitation in ethnobotany and move towards true collaboration. But these phases are all overlapping. None of them are done per se. They're more of kind of trends that come and go. But that's to give you a sense of kind of how ethnobotanists have conceived of the field over time. Ethnobotany and economic botany are often used interchangeably. Some people don't like one, some people don't like the other. But yeah, it's that's just how people have conceptualized it. It's not necessarily the be all end all of the story of ethnobotany.
And I would add, one of the things that we're so excited about in having Alex at the New York Botanical Garden is that he brings such a wonderful combination of tools, and especially the traditions of ethnobotany and understanding plant diversity and how people are using plants and going into the field and getting firsthand knowledge, but then the powerful tools to understand genetic diversity and to understand the evolutionary history of the plants that we rely on for our survival. We're out of time here. We're basically at the end. I think there's time for one more question, which of course this one speaks to me more than any of the others because it's coming from a student. And the question is, I'm a recent college grad, and I want to know how I could get involved or what field of study I should explore if I want to learn about preserving, cultivating genetic plant diversity. And of course, we want to, give you an opportunity, Alex, to encourage a student to pursue botany or plant-related fields. What would you have to say about that?
Great, yeah, I'd say feel free to email me and we can talk further, but you can really come at it from hundreds of angles. You could go get your agronomy degree, you could go get your anthropology degree, or work in the nonprofit sector. You could go any number of ways. I just happened to go through a botany graduate program, but there are global consortia to get involved in, and so there are pathways to those. There are pathways to being a professor and doing it from that angle. Please, anybody do reach out to me if you're interested in getting more involved in this stuff, and happy to chat.
Yes, great. Any of our scientists are happy to provide this kind of information. I'll also say that a lot of times we have beginning graduate students who want more information about plants and to know more about plant diversity. And one of the great resources that we can offer here at the garden is our adult education course catalog. And every semester, every year, we're offering courses in plant diversity and basic botany. So that's another place to look to get more information about plants if you're in the New York City area. And many of those classes are now available online too. So time to wrap it up. If you just mention that if you missed any part of this event, or if you want to watch it again, a recording has been saved and it will be published in the NYBG lecture library. We hope you will join us for future science, conservation, and humanities webinars. Next week, Friday, October 1st, please join us for Plant-Based Foods and the City, From Seed to Takeout. Those of you who have not already registered may sign up using a link that I'll post in the chat in just a few seconds. Until next time, please stay well, stay green, and take care. Goodbye, everyone. And thank you again, Alex, for this wonderful presentation.
Thank you, everyone.